Ghana is taking a bold step to calm tensions, giving public sector workers a 15% cost of living allowance. This comes as the country battles inflation and a liquidity crisis. And from Ghana, we'll also head to the Central African Republic, which is introducing its own cryptocurrency into the market. We'll tell you about the Sango coin later on. Alphabet Incorporated, which is the parent company for Google, has split its shares. This is sending all types of signals to the market and may herald the end of a tech giant era. That's the lineup for Business Edge today. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. African Business Headlines starts us off. We start in Nigeria with some news that may not make Nigerians very happy, but the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation Limited has approved an upward review in the pump price of petrol from 165 naira per liter to 179 naira per liter, effective from Tuesday, 19th of July 2022. The new price is in line with the feedback from fuel marketers who have said they cannot sell at the former rate and asked to sell at 180 naira per liter. We move now to the eastern parts of the continent, where Kenya has signed a deal with millers to cut the price of maize flour by half under a treasury-backed subsidy that could see a retailer risk a fine of 1 million Kenyan shillings or a 5-year jail term for selling the commodity above 100 Kenyan shillings. The Ministry of Agriculture said millers would be offered an undisclosed subsidy to bring down the cost of the staple from above 210 Kenyan shillings a packet. And staying there, Kenya has received a 7.48 billion Kenyan shillings loan from the African Development Bank to support fertilizer and seeds acquisition for 650,000 local farmers in order to boost food production and control consumer price inflation. The loan is part of the AFDB's $1.5 billion or 177 billion shillings African Emergency Food Production Facility, an Africa-wide initiative to avert a looming food crisis exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Egypt's exports of agricultural crops increased by 9.30% year-on-year to $2.15 billion during the 9 months from September 2021 to May 2022, compared to $1.97 billion. In the September 2021 to May 2022 period, Egypt exported 3.54 million tons of agricultural crops, which is actually an annual slide of 2.6% from 3.64 million tons. And we wrap up African headlines in Ghana, where the Ghana National Gas Company has distinguished itself again as the first wholly Ghanaian-owned state enterprise in the energy sector to have been awarded ISO certification. The independent certification audits were carried out by DNV, a globally acclaimed expert in assurance and risk management with headquarters in Norway. And those are the headlines for you at this time. We'll get into our first conversation, which takes us into one of the largest economies right here in the West African sub-region. Ghana has approved a 15% cost of living allowance for public sector workers. The details after this. Now, Ghana saw protests in June as people hit the streets to demonstrate against the powerful and painful feelings they got with the rise in the cost of living. It appears that Ghana's government has listened. The country has since introduced an allowance for public sector workers to help them maintain their standard of living and quality of life. Ghana will now pay 15% of a public employee's base pay to help workers cope with the rising cost of living as a result of the war between Ukraine and Russia. And this policy comes as a result of negotiations between the government of Ghana and organized labor. The cost of living crisis has reduced consumer spending, with food prices being up 30% year-on-year. Energy prices have climbed sharply, while inflation climbed to 29.8% in June this year. Now joining me is Dr. Josh Bamfo. He's partner and head transfer pricing and economic advisory services for Andersen, Nigeria. Dr. Bamfo, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tolu, for having me.
So let's just get straight to it. How effective do you think this 15% allowance to public sector workers will be in order to help reduce some of the impact of Ghana's current economic situation? Dr. Bamfo? Okay, I think that is technology at play there, but I'm very sure he'll be back with us quite quickly. And the conversation around Ghana, of course, is one that is reminiscent of what's happening to many African economies at this point in time. And it's a situation where issues coming economic and probably historic issues around debt and some other things have hit the COVID-19 pandemic conversations. Of course, a lot of lockdowns and a lot of restrictions of movement hits the economies quite hard. Coming out of that, we now, of course, unfortunately this year, experiencing the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how that has brought an increase in food prices, in fuel prices, and therefore also in the standard of living and the cost of living. So those are some of the economic headwinds that not just Ghana is facing, but also many economies across the continent. And with that being said, Ghana is also facing a liquidity conversation as well. It's also facing a debt one, with some worried about Ghana possibly going into debt default, but many agree that the country is in debt distress. And we know that just about 2 weeks ago, the government did say that they were in communications with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to look at a package in how they would be able to work together to get a handle on Ghana's economic situation. We'll take a quick break here. When we come back, hopefully we'll be having Dr. Bamfo with us once again. Glad to have Dr. Josh Bamfo back with us as we look at Ghana bringing about a 15% public sector wage allowance for its workers. So, Dr. Bamfo, I'll start from there very quickly so we can gather some steam. Do you think that this allowance to public sector workers will be effective in helping them sort of cushion the current situation that Ghana finds itself?
Yes, I think that it's going to be effective in the sense that we all know that inflation has gone up. Upwards of 20%, and now at 29%. So any form of additional allowance to workers is going to help deal with the eroded purchasing power due to the high inflation. It's very important that government gets this done, because apart from the erosion of the purchasing power of these workers, there was going to be a number of strikes. And some of these workers could decide not to go to work, such as teachers, nurses, and these are all critical sectors of the economy. And you don't want those sectors to disrupt the level of economic activity in the country at this particular point in time when there are a lot of economic challenges. So I think it is timely, and hopefully this will help pushing the significant economic woes that most Ghanaians are feeling at this particular point in time. So I think it is timely and very sensitive of the government to have negotiated something good with the organized labor unions of the public sector workers.
So I'm curious in terms of where the financing for this will come from, because I don't think it's something that was budgeted for when Ghana was approving its budget for this year. And the country has experienced slow economic growth, accumulation of unpaid bills, a large exchange rate depreciation, and also a surge in inflation. So where is the government going to get the money for this?
So coincidentally, this deal was brokered on the same day that, Ghana agreed to enter into an IMF program, and negotiate with IMF for some IMF program going forward. So I want to believe that there is some level of comfort that should the IMF program commence, there will be some injection of, additional funds into the economy that can help offset such additional expenditures that were budgeted for from the beginning of the year. So I think going to the IMF and having the expectation that some concessional loans will be coming in to help deal with balance of payment deficits that we are facing, and also the fact that we still have the e-levy tax. Hopefully it will get better over time, all these sources of injection of funds. And hopefully if the country becomes more credible in terms of its ability to pay off its existing loans. Maybe the credit rating downgrade that some of the independent credit rating agencies did will be reversed and can help them to go to the international markets to also borrow for their short-term needs. So I believe they were able to make this decision based on the projection that they're going to get some additional injection of funds, be it from the IMF or the international markets, or even the yield levy tax, which is still in existence, to be able to fund such additional expenditures that were not anticipated in the beginning of the year.
Okay, so let's also look at who this allowance is going to. So Ghana's public sector workers, according to available statistics, are still less than about 1 million. And the World Bank figures put the country's total labor force at just over 13 million workers. What happens to those who are not in the public sector? What kind of leeway do they get from the current high cost of living? And when you look at this allowance, do you think it can have some kind of impact beyond just the public sector employees? They may be the first direct beneficiaries, but do you really expect some kind of trickle-down economics here?
So clearly, there is obviously the political side of things as well as the economic side of things. So let's start with the economics. So there's a need for employers, be it public sector or private sector, to recognize the fact that inflation has skyrocketed, which means that people's purchasing power has reduced. And if their purchasing power has reduced, then their standard of living will also reduce, because now they can buy less goods and services with the same amount of earnings that they are having. So it's important that employers recognize this. However, with the private sector, you usually do not have labor unions that are organized to actually make such a strong, forceful case for increases in salaries that you typically have in the public sector. So from the public sector point of view, I think this is important, even though the size of the number of people within the public sector is relatively smaller compared to the labor force in general. This is going to have a rippling effect. So if you have an individual that is working in the public sector that has had, a 50% increase in its base pay, it's going to have rippling effect for other, members of the families or relatives, that can also enjoy from such an income.
Okay.
So it's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to help curb or mitigate it a little bit. So that is the good news from this. Hopefully, the private sector will also recognize this and reflect it in terms of adjustments to the compensation packages of the employees. But clearly, they don't face the same level of pressure as the public sector folks face. That is going to be purely dependent on demand and supply in the labor force for the private sector. Because if there's excess, supply of labor in the private sector, then the employers who are in business to maximize profits might not have the incentive or the need to actually increase the wages and salaries of the employees, unless they also face some shortages or challenges. Then they might be forced to also increase those salaries to reflect the high inflation rate.
So do we have a timeline for this? Because with this 15%, and of course, as we said earlier, the IMF conversations, there right now is no expiration date on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Is this something you expect to last into 2023 and possibly beyond? Has government said this is only for 6 months to help us bridge this gap? What do we know about this in terms of duration? And what would you actually advise?
So my expectation is I think it's important that government entered into this arrangement or this deal with the labor unions at this point, because clearly once the IMF program kicks in, there's the expectation that IMF will have some conditionalities, and those conditionalities are typically geared towards making sure that the Ghana government manages its fiscal issues better. And this usually comes from two perspectives. First is to cut down, waste in terms of expenditures, and also mobilize additional revenues in order to reduce their budget deficit to GDP ratio to the target rate of about around 5%. So the question that will be coming up will be, would IMF be okay with this increase in this in the salaries of these public sectors? In the past, some of the experiences we've seen will be recommendations such as IMF making sure that no new employees are brought into the public sector, and sometimes there could be freezes in terms of increases in salaries. So we are yet to know the kind of conditionalities that will come up or emanate from the IMF program. At least the government is doing this before the program actually kicks in, where we do expect some of these conditionalities. So as to whether this can be sustained over a long period of time, especially when the IMF program kicks in, will be dependent on how the government is able to negotiate with the IMF in terms of the conditionalities. Bear in mind, this is a clear situation of a global phenomenon of high inflation across board, even though Ghana is hard hit compared to other jurisdictions, but 29.8 is really on the high side.
Yes, and let's talk about that inflation. 29.8% in June, the highest that Ghana has experienced since January 2004. Beyond the obvious cause of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which is affecting all of us on the continent, is there anything else in particular that seems to be driving Ghana's inflation up?
So I think the multiplicity of factors. One is the fact that, imported inflation is on the high side. I think it's above 30%, which is higher than the headline inflation rate itself, which will be a reflection of the fact that there's been significant depreciation of the Ghana cedi to hard currencies such as the US dollar in recent times. And if that is the case, that means that for any product or service that we import, we have to actually change more Ghana cedis for a dollar to make that importation. And then that person will then have to pass on that additional cost to final consumers. So clearly, those are some of the challenges. The weakness of the Ghana cedi to foreign currencies such as the USD is leading to some significant, imported inflation into the economy. And that is relatively unique to Ghana's situation because of, some of our debt challenges and the fact that our credit rating was downgraded, and we cannot in the short term actually borrow from international markets to show up our international reserves and therefore forex in supply into the foreign exchange market. So that could be a unique situation other countries might not be facing. The other bit is the fact that over time, we know that we are trying to restructure economy from an import-dependent economy to an export-oriented one. And that is going to take some time. And part of the industrialization policy of the current government, probably called the One District, One Factory, is supposed to help in that particular vein, but it's not really been as impactful as anticipated, at least for now. So over time, if we become more export-oriented, then some of these important inflation challenges that we are facing will also be kept. Another unique situation is the fact that Ghana doesn't have fuel subsidies. That was taken off in 2015 when we went to IMF. So with the Ukraine crisis and crude oil prices going up, which is impacting fuel prices, this directly hits the final consumer, as opposed to a country like Nigeria, where we do, Nigeria still has, fuel subsidies, which cushions the impact of fuel prices and its rippling effect on the economy. So there are a number of factors that are now unique to Ghana's situation that has made Ghana's situation worse than comparable economies within the same sub-region. But by and large, the Ukraine crisis has been a major contributor to this challenge, and that's the reason why it's a global phenomenon.
All right, so Dr. Bamfo, before I let you go, we saw that in May, Ghana increased its baseline interest rates by 200 basis points to 19% in a bid to keep inflation under control. And we know that on the 25th of this month, Ghana's Monetary Policy Committee will be meeting and will likely announce what it will do with the country's base interest rates this time. What are your expectations? Do you see more increases in the baseline interest rates in the future? Will the MPC hold, or maybe for some reason we might see a decrease? What do you think is going to happen?
So clearly, the Bank of Ghana, which is the central bank of Ghana, has its work cut out for them. Clearly, their number one mandate is to be able to rein in high inflation. The target inflation for the Bank of Ghana is 8% plus or minus 2% range. That means between 6% to 10%. Today, we are around 29.8%, way off the target. So their number one mandate would be to actually curb inflation. And the only tool they have, a monetary policy tool to do this, is to actually implement what we call a contraction in monetary policy, which means that interest rates or the monetary policy rate would have to be increased so that cost of borrowing is more expensive, so that households and businesses will not borrow as much and spend as much, especially at a time when we have limited growth, which could put an upward pressure on prices in general. So my expectation is that they are likely to increase it again, but not as much as they did the last time. So if they increase it by 200 basis points to 19%, my expectation is that there could be another increase, but not anything more than 100 basis points. Somewhere between 19 to 20% will be expected. At least that's my personal opinion, because we still have not seen the inflation rate fully plateau, even though the rate of increase has declined, comparing the June data to previous months, but it's yet to actually plateau and start, reducing. My expectation would be that if it starts declining, then they might stabilize the monetary policy rate for a bit before they start decreasing it in order to try to stimulate the economy to generate more job opportunities. So in the short term, my expectation is for them to focus on curbing inflation and therefore increase the monetary policy rate to somewhere pretty close to 20%, if not 20%.
All right, Dr. Josh Bamfo, we'll see if you will become a prophet with a crystal ball in the next few days when Ghana's MPC meets. But we'll definitely be following up these conversations happening in this economy in West Africa, one that we kept our eyes on for a long time. Dr. Bamfo, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Tolu, for having me.
All right. And before we get into international business news, we have some exciting news for you. The Business Edge team has a new member, and I'm very happy to introduce Damilola Adeodeachi, who joins me now. Damilola, you've heard what Dr. Bamfo said. Is it really different from what many other African economies are going through right now? Would we expect to see some others possibly following suit with a public allowance or something for public sector workers to cushion the effects of the current situations?
Many thanks for welcoming me, Tolu. I'm really glad to be here. I think that it would be a really good policy move because we've seen the cost of living skyrocket across Africa, and people are really struggling at this time to make ends meet. So it would be a really good move. I think that Ghana's been really innovative with how it's gone about it by just cushioning the blow for the public sector workers and hoping for a bit of a trickle down. And maybe it'll also help boost public spending. Consumption is one of the largest components of aggregate demand. So that could help bolster economic growth going forward.
And right before I let you go, at the African headlines as we started, news that Nigeria has now approved 179 naira per liter for PMS. And of course, Dr. Bamfo mentioned the subsidy in play. So maybe if there was no subsidy, it might be a lot more than this. But marketers had asked for 180 naira. How do you think Nigerians are going to react? This news is just really trickling in, and we haven't seen too many reactions yet on social media. So it might be later in the day. But what do you think is going to happen?
Nigerians are not going to be happy because, like we just discussed, the cost of living across Africa has gone up. And so we will see increases in transport prices, increases in the cost of everything. So a lot of Nigerians won't be happy. But then I think a lot of economists will see the upside because Nigeria has been spending a lot of money to support its fuel subsidy. And if it can spend a little bit less, I think some economists and people interested in Nigeria's finances will be a little pleased. But for the people at large, no, unhappiness.
And definitely we'll be seeing what small businesses and of course those involved in transports and even just buying fuel for home use will be saying in the coming days. But after this break, Dami is going to take us through the latest in international business. You're watching Business Edge. Stay with us.